Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for being with us on this Wednesday afternoon here at the Pikes Peak Library District, as we are happy to welcome author J.v.L. Bell for her presentation of Pikes Peak or Bust, Colorado Women's 59'ers. In the early years of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, men outnumbered women 20 to 1. Yet women played an important role in every aspect of mining. Life for these early women settlers was difficult, filled with long days of washing clothes, cooking, and running boarding houses. But several women established more unusual roles. She'll talk about the adventures of several well-known frontiers women and a couple that went to the lengths of dressing like a man so they could mine her own claims, and one of Colorado's first African-American settlers. From papering their walls to washtub panning, these women lived amazing lives and have very interesting stories. Author J.v.L. Bell has written several books, including two works of fiction, two novels, The Lucky Hat Mine and Denver City Justice, as well as her first nonfiction book, Elizabeth Byers, Denver Pioneer, that was published in 2019 by Filter Press. We are happy to have with us this Wednesday afternoon, Julie Bell.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you for the Pikes Peak Library District for inviting me to come. I'm truly honored. Before I start my presentation, I thought it might be fun to have a book giveaway. So one of the first things I do in my presentation is I ask who was the first non-native pioneer that settled here in Colorado, woman pioneer that settled here in Colorado. So what I'd like to do is have each of the viewers take a guess at who they think it might be, and then also put in a number between 1 and 100. So if two people guess the correct answer, we'll have a number to determine who won this little competition, and then the person who won can get a book from me. So please do that right away, because I'm going to ask that almost immediately for my presentation. So now I'm going to say bye, and I'm going to put on a presentation because I like to be able to share the pictures as I talk. So as Brian said, my theme tonight is Pikes Peak or Bust, the stories from Colorado's women 59'ers. And there we go. This presentation started because I love to write fiction, and I had a woman protagonist who came to Colorado in 1863. And I was like, so what is it really like for a woman here in Colorado in 1863? So I started doing that research, and it took me down this amazing journey that I'm going to share sort of with you tonight. So it started out with finding this journal from Elizabeth Byers, and it's the experiences of one pioneer woman. And I read this and I was like, this is just amazing. And yet nobody had ever written anything about Elizabeth Byers. And so it eventually led me down the road to publish a Now You Know Bio-Honor and to continue researching these women because they're just fascinating. So in 1860, the census reported that there were about 34,000 settlers living in Colorado Territory, and less than 5% of this population were women. And yet you never hear about these women because the Pikes Peak Gold Rush is usually told from a male perspective. Some of these women were women we've heard a little bit about, maybe Augusta Tabor or Clara Brown, but very few people have heard of Addie LaMont or Katrina Murat. So that's what I'm going to try and talk to you about, is share some of the stories from these people's lives. So here's the question I asked. So hopefully everybody has entered something in chat. Who was the first non-native woman to pioneer to settle here in Colorado? And I started looking this up, and this is where I realized that, wow, our history is one, very, very male-oriented for the gold rush, and two, it's very Anglo-oriented. So I looked at these two really good references, Colorado and Its People, written by the director of the Historical Society of Colorado, and the History of Colorado, and they were prepared by the State Historical and Natural History Society of Colorado. And they gave me two different answers, neither of which I tend to agree, but let me share them with you. So Colorado and Its People said that on August 30th, Mrs. Rooker settled here, and on November 3rd, the Count and Countess Murat arrived. And I was like, oh, okay, so that's probably the right answer. And then I dug a little deeper. And one of the reasons I start this way is every time you dig deeper, you learn more. So if I say anything today that you disagree with, then what I would recommend is that you send me an email or send me a question, because the more that you dig, the more you learn. And nobody was really writing these things down. So when I dug a little deeper, I learned that, oh, well, the Count and Countess Murat did move to Denver, but before that, they lived in a place called Montana City, and they arrived there on August 30th. And Montana City was located in present-day intersection of South Huron and West Evans Street. So I was like, oh, okay, so it's Countess Murat. And then I dug a little deeper, and I'm like, oh, that totally disregards all the settlers who came here as Hispanos in southern Colorado. And so as you dig, you learn a little bit more. And so I'm going to wait and see what your answers are, and then we'll find out what you think. But Countess Murat sort of took she became a woman that I was like, well, she may not have been first, but she lived here all her life. She was known as the Mother of Colorado, which is really amazing because she was a German and she spoke very poor English. She was born in Germany, and she arrived in Denver, where she and her husband set up and built and ran the El Dorado Hotel. And it's interesting because she is called Countess Murat, but whether she was a true countess or not, well, nobody really knows. But even though she was a countess for the El Dorado Hotel, she was both cook, maid, and she just basically ran the place. One of the most interesting things about Countess Murat is that she sewed the first American flag to ever fly over the Cherry Creek settlements. Now, nobody really knows what it looks like because in 1859, there was no set pattern for the stars. But we do know that she used her red Murano skirt purchased in Paris for the red, and that she bought some blue cotton off a Mexican trader and used her white silk petticoat for the white stripes and the white stars. She met Horace Greeley in 1859, and what was interesting about the Countess Murat is she made and lost at least two fortunes, she and her husband. They were pretty good at making money, but they were also very good at spending money. She is supposed to have earned over $50,000 selling her $2 pies and doing laundry in Denver. And she ended up dying in Palmer Lake on March 13th and basically being a pauper. So it was really, she's got a fascinating history. So she was one of my favorite people to start this with. And I'm going to go on now to Elizabeth Byers, because when I found that manuscript, I was like, her story's got to be shared. So she's known because William Byers started the first newspaper here in the Denver area, the Rocky Mountain News, and she married him. And they moved to Oklahoma City. And then, like many people, 1857, the economical crash happened and he lost his job. And really the reason the Pikes Peak Gold Rush was such a big deal was because so many people were in financial straits. So he left her and her two little children in their little cabin in Oklahoma. And he traveled to the Pikes Peak area and settled in the Cherry Creek settlement, hoping to produce the first newspaper of the settlement. And what happened was he arrived and found out there was another man making another newspaper, the Cherry Creek Pioneer. And in true pioneering spirit, he set up his areas in an area, a Wooten Saloon in the upper area, and the other man set up his press, and they started putting their newspapers together. And Colorado, Denver, the Cherry Creek settlements got into this race, and they go back and forth. And it said that on April 23rd, 1859, Byers came down holding a copy of the Rocky Mountain News, and he beat out the Cherry Creek Pioneer by 20 minutes. And the man who had started the Cherry Creek Pioneer threw in the towel, sold Byers his press, and the Rocky Mountain News was established as the first newspaper in the Cherry Creek settlements. Well, once his newspaper was established, he went back and he picked up his wife, and they got a man to bring them back to the West. And they had 2 wagons, and they got to Fort Kearny. And there it was sort of interesting. In her journal, she writes, well, we weren't really excited about the man who was helping us with the crossing of the Great Plains. But I think really they were worried about their fledgling business. So they met the man who set up the Overland Stagecoach Company. And he's like, well, I've got my stage shop set up, I've got horses set up, but I don't have any stagecoaches. They said, no problem, we'll travel 365 miles in a buckboard wagon. And here's why I found her journal so fascinating. She writes at this time, you can imagine how cramped we were in a vehicle of that kind, traveling day and night, stopping, of course, every 10 miles. We had our meals at the station and came through without accident or very great discomfort. Can you imagine traveling in an open wagon with 2 little kids that far and having just that much to say? But she arrived in the Cherry Creek settlements on August 7th, 1859, and her husband set her up in a small 1-room cabin with a dirt floor, but she was thrilled because it didn't have a dirt roof, so she didn't have mud dripping on her when it rained. Well, she never really talked much about what Denver or the Cherry Creek settlements were like when she arrived, but what she would have found is that Denver was located on one side of the river, and then Auraria was on the other side of the river. Auraria had been set up by the original men, the Georgians who found the first gold in Colorado, and there was this big rivalry between the two. But since she didn't describe what it was like when she first arrived, I sort of did some digging. And Lavina Porter visited Denver in 1860, and she described Denver as a town where horses, cows, and hogs roamed at will all over. And then Liberius Barney, who was on the first stagecoach, he would have seen the flag made by Katrina Murat, said, this marvelous city contains about 150 log cabins, some with roofs and more without. It was not an easy place to raise 2 children. So her journal contains all these wonderful stories about her life here. But I think what she wrote that I found most poignant was she wrote, there is much that is pathetic in a pioneer's life and much that is awfully funny. We often laugh through tears. And one of those stories that's sort of a laugh through tears is one evening her husband came home and said, I've invited the Pathfinders to dinner. So he'd invited Colonel St. Vrain, Jim Baker, Kit Carson, and Jim Beckworth. So any issues here? Well, for me, I would have been like, I can't cook dinner in a small cabin with a small cook stove for all these fancy people. But her problem was actually Jim Beckworth. She wrote, I found that one man, Jim Beckworth, was a colored man. My aristocratic Virginia blood rather boiled because I hadn't been used to sitting at a table with a colored man, and I hardly knew what to do, but almost instantly decided there was but one thing to do, and that was to ignore it altogether and treat them all alike, which I did. That's a remarkable attitude for a woman before the Civil War. And I think that's one of the reasons that she was so remarkable to me as I read her journal. I also think that's a statement on how difficult it was to survive in Colorado. Everybody had to help each other, no matter your skin color or where you came from, because it was just not easy to survive. Well, Elizabeth Byers was known because she helped organize many of Denver's charitable organizations. The first charitable organization in Denver was the Ladies Union Aid Society, and she was the president, and the first meeting was held in her house. She helped build the first homeless shelter, the Ladies Relief Home, and she helped organize the Denver Orphans Home. She was really a woman of compassion. And, you know, they talk about when a new church was set up and they didn't have any decorations, she went into her own decorations and helped them out, even though it wasn't her church. So she was a lady of compassion, and yet no one ever hears about her because they hear about her husband. In fact, what I found interesting is Thomas Noel, one of the really important historians of Colorado from today, wrote, although William Byers remains prominent as Colorado's greatest booster and the founder of the Rocky Mountain News, his wife's role as a pioneer philanthropist is largely forgotten. And I think that's what you're going to find when you start digging into these women. They were either minimalized or they were largely forgotten. So let's see who else we can find about. Well, this is one of my favorite people. Mountain Charlie ran the Denver City Mountain Boys Saloon. And Mountain Charlie was described as someone who could swear like a double-crossed cowboy, gamble like a swindler, and downhouse lightning like an outlaw. He was a legend of a man until, what do you think? Well, until they learned he wasn't actually a man. He was a woman in the guise of a man. His name was actually Miss Elsa Jane Forest from St. Louis. And this story comes from her book there on the side that she wrote as an autobiography. And it's a sort of a fascinating story. So she was 16 years old when a man named Jameson shot and killed her husband. And it left her in a bind. You know, women had few options. She was probably illiterate. She could work the streets as a prostitute, or she could work as a domestic, but she couldn't do either of those with children. And so she chose to take on the guise of a man so she could support her children. So she gave her children up to the care of the Sisters of Charity, and she became a cabin boy in a steamer. And she was soon discovered, but she didn't give up. She must have been a remarkable young woman, because she became a brakeman on the Illinois Central. And then she slowly built up this career of being a man. And by 1855, she was in California hauling provisions for the gold camps. And then in the early gold rush, she arrived in Denver and she opened up the Mountain Boys Saloon. And by that point, she was very good at her guise. And in her book, she says, when I was asked why she continued in this guise, she said, I began to rather like the freedom of my new character. I could go where I choose, do many things which, while innocent in themselves, were debarred by propriety from the association with the female sex. The change from cumbersome, unhealthy attire of woman to the more convenient, healthy attire of men was in itself almost sufficient to compensate for its unwomanly character. And normally when we're in person, I come dressed in a full 1860 garb, including my corset. And after about 2 hours, man, do I understand that sentiment. Women's clothes were heavy and they weren't particularly comfortable. Unfortunately, when all I'm doing is sitting at a table, wearing a corset's really uncomfortable. So I missed out on the costumes. But maybe next year we'll actually be able to do this in person. So 1860, Elsa Jane is running her bar and she goes up into the mountains to go hunting. And who does she run into but Jameson? And she recognizes him. And as she says, I emptied my revolver upon him, but my revenge was interrupted by 2 hunters. This was probably good because Jameson survived long enough to admit that he had killed her husband. And so she was not punished for the shooting of Jameson. But he also gave up her secret and said she's a woman. What's she gonna do? Well, she's gonna do what we would have done today. She sold her bar, married her bartender, moved to St. Joe, and wrote her biography, her autobiography. So that is Mountain Charlie. And I try and intermix sort of fun characters with a little bit more serious throughout here. So she wasn't the only unique woman that I found. If you look here, this is the Clear Creek Mining Journal, and it says, on the Upper Fall River was surveyed by Dan L. Bryan, and lots were preempted by more than 50 men and 1 woman, Charlotte Card, who appeared to have some knowledge of mineralogy as she climbed the hills looking for signs. And Charlotte Card was a woman who wore men's clothes. She did her own mining. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to find out much about her. But the one interesting thing that I have found about her is that they believe that she was the reason that the Empire Mining District in 1860 included a resolution against discrimination against a miner's sex. So I thought that was a truly interesting little piece of history that has sort of gotten lost. So the next woman I'd like to tell you about is Comanche Prowers. And most people think of Comanche as the Japanese relocation camp in Grenada. And nobody really knows who who the name was responsible for. She's seldom mentioned. But she was this remarkable woman. She was a full-blooded Southern Cheyenne, and she was 15 years old when she married John Prowers in 1861. And she began her life as a woman in between. She was both Cheyenne, and she stayed very much in touch with her culture and her people. And she was married to this Anglo, and she learned how to wear Victorian clothes, and she ran a stagecoach stop. So she was really this fascinating character from both sides. So in 1854, John and Amanche had done well, and they were living on their cattle ranch near Bent's Fort. And on sundown of November 26th of 1864, soldiers from Company E arrived, and they locked him down. Basically, they disarmed all the men, including her husband, and they wouldn't let him leave. And a few days later, when they were allowed to leave, they learned about the Sand Creek Massacre that Chivington had initiated. You can see on this display here how they were living near Fort Wise, and they were held down so they couldn't warn anybody. So Amanche's father, One Eye, was killed in Sand Creek, as were many of her relatives. Years later, it said, Amanche was introduced to Colonel Chivington and asked if she knew him. And according to her daughter, Amanche drew herself up with that stately dignity, particular to people, and ignoring the outstretched hand of Chivington, she remarked in perfect English, audible to everyone in the room, "No, Colonel Chivington? I should. He was my father's murderer." So she was a really interesting woman, and because she and her husband did so well, she ran in very different circles, both highly political circles of the Anglos and trying to help her people, her Cheyenne people. After the Sand Creek Massacre, one of the things I learned that I had never realized were that the survivors were given 640 acres of land as restitution. So Amanche and her two daughters were given this acres of land. They chose very wisely of really nice land along the Arkansas River. And it's one of the reasons that her husband did so well in the cattle ranch, is because she had this land that they could use then to graze their cattle. They lived their whole life in South Colorado, and despite being illiterate, she was fluent in English, Spanish, and Cheyenne, I'm sorry. And so she was a very strong advocate both for the Hispanos and for the Cheyenne in Southern Colorado. She was very active in her church and her community. And after her husband died, she ran their cattle business and their store for many years. So she was known as a very astute businesswoman. So she lived this really interesting life. And it's sort of sad to me that her people know her only through this Japanese internment camp. One of the best stories I read about her was after her husband's death, you really saw how strong that Cheyenne heritage was through her daughter's memory of a dinner party. And it was attended by several Anglos, but also by Little Elk, Amanche's half-brother, and White River, her cousin. And after dinner, they all sat around, Cheyenne style, and passed a pipe from one person to another. So that culture continued to be intermixed throughout her life. And then one of my favorite stories is about Lucy Davis Maggard Colby. And most people have never heard of her, but she was known as Mother Maggard. And she was widowed from Mr. Maggard and left with 4 children to raise. And she chose to do that by running a boarding house. And for a while, she lived in Franklin, Kansas. But in 1856, border ruffians burned her home down. And that didn't go over so well. So in 1859, she came to the Cherry Creek settlements and started the El Paso House, which was a boarding house. And if that had been all she had done, she would have never really been remembered. But they wrote a wonderful article about her and described her as a tall and lanky female with an abundance of homeliness, with tangled locks of faded carrot hue, and with store teeth poorly set on misfit frames. And it's because of those store teeth on misfit frames that people know about Mother Maggard. So in 1860, she returned to Kansas, gathered her family and a bunch of other people, and brought them back to Denver. And she sort of led this group across the plains. But unfortunately, near Julesburg, Colorado, her wagon train was attacked by Indians. And the story goes that as the Indians circled the wagon, Mother Maggard cried, "In the name of God, don't fire." And amazingly enough, the men held their fire, and Mother Maggard climbed up onto the seat of an ox cart, and she held a skillet aloud and began yelling and singing this wild song. But what she really did is, as she sang and yelled, she manipulated her false teeth in a manner that, as described, it made her seem like a witch, and it worked. The Native Americans didn't know what to make of her. They didn't know what to make of these teeth that could move in and out of her face. And they left, and she returned to Denver a hero. So after her hero's welcome, she went on running the El Paso house for many years until new adventures called her away from Colorado. So that's Mother Maggard. So Clara Brown is one of the most fascinating pioneers we have, because she was one of our first African-American women pioneers here in Colorado. She was born a slave around 1803. As a slave, nobody really knows her birth date. But as a slave, she experienced all the terrible things that slaves did. So in 1835, when she was about 30 to 35 years old, she watched as her family was sold. Her older daughter went to one new master, her son went to another, and her husband was sent to another. And she watched her 10-year-old daughter, Eliza Jane, scream as she was dragged away. I just can't even imagine. She was bought by a gentleman named George Brown, and she served her master well until she was 56 years old. And when he died, he left her $475 and a wish that she should be freed. Well, she was living in Kentucky. That left her in an interesting spot, because Kentucky law said to be freed, Clara had to be put back on the auction block. And if she was bought and was able to pay for a quarter of her purchase price, she could be freed. And the children of her former master bought her because he had left her money. She was able to pay that quarter of her purchase price. And so at age 56, she was free. But in Kentucky, a free Black woman at that time who stayed in the state for more than a year could be forced back into slavery. So Clara left, and she went in search of her youngest daughter, Eliza Jane. And she would search for Eliza Jane for the rest of her life. So part of her searching, she decided to head west. But in 1859, even if you were a free African American, you were not allowed to buy a ticket on public transportation. And boy, that was a fact that, as an author who tries to really do a good job of researching my facts, I was like, man, let me look into this. And I dug for about 3 weeks, and I think it's a correct fact. So either way, Clara Brown hired on as a wagon train cook, and she traveled with them to Denver. She arrived in Denver, and then in the spring of 1880, she set off for Gilpin County and became a laundress. And she lived there for many years, and she was beloved. She became known as Aunt Clara, and her door was always open. She didn't see color. She was a highly religious woman, and she was just a wonderful woman. She would grub stake miners, meaning she would provide money for them to go out and find their mines. She delivered babies. She nursed injured miners. She fed and took care of those in need. And through this all, she would save money, and then she would search for her daughter. And believe it or not, she found her daughter eventually. So after 46 years of searching in 1882, she finally found her daughter, Eliza Jane, and found out she had a granddaughter, Cindy. And she was inducted into the Colorado Society of Pioneers in 1882, which, if you think about it, as an African American, that's pretty remarkable. But probably my favorite article about Clara Brown was written in the Rocky Mountain News, and it was entitled "A Woman in 1,000." And it included a description that said, "We will put Aunt Clara against the world, white or Black, for industry, perseverance, energy, and filial love." So she was truly loved in Colorado despite her color. So the last woman that I want to talk about is Addie LaMont. And Addie LaMont's not a woman that most people have heard about in Colorado. She was 17 when she married the young minister of her church, and 2 years later, As the news of gold came from the Pikes Peak region, Ada and her husband decided to head west, not to search for gold, but actually to bring the gospel into the wilderness. So when you traveled west, there were actual multiple routes you could take. So you could take the northern route along the Platte, or you could take the southern route along the Santa Fe Trail. And then if you look here, there's this Republican River. That was sort of a middle route, but people got lost because that river didn't go all the way through. And so that wasn't one of the better routes. But Ada and her family decided, or Ada and her husband took the northern route and followed the Platte River. And for weeks, they went deeper and deeper into the vast sun-baked prairie, and they left all the comforts of civilization behind. And then tragedy struck. So one night, halfway across the Great Plains, Ada's husband disappeared. And unfortunately, he disappeared the same night. A woman of very doubtful reputation also went missing. Oh, Ada was just devastated at what that implied. And it said that during that long, long journey, Ada maintained a totally stony silence. She said nothing. And it wasn't until they reached Denver in 1859 that Ada finally found her voice. It said that when they reached Denver, they went to Indian Row, which was one of the districts, one of the areas in Denver, and she stood upon a barrel and she made an announcement. And she said, "As a God-fearing woman, you see me for the last time. As of tomorrow, I start the first brothel in this settlement. In the future, my name will be Addie LaMont. Any of you men in need of a little fun will always find the flaps of my tent open." So Ada LaMont was Denver City's first prostitute. And as can be well imagined in a place that had very few women, she did very well. From then on, every man who met her acclaimed her charms. She prospered, and within a year, she'd opened a pretentious 2-story house on Arapahoe Street, and she ran that house for 10 years. She was considered one of the best houses in Denver. She was known for serving good liquor because a lot of these places had watered down liquor, and she operated a clean house. So everything was going well. She amassed a fortune, that was going well. But then once again, tragedy struck poor Addie LaMont. From the Great Plains, a ghost was given up. So a friend returning from Kansas stumbled upon a skeleton, and it turned out that this man had been shot in the back of the head, and underneath his skeleton was a Bible, and it was a Bible with Ada's signature in it. And she was devastated. All of a sudden, she realized that her husband hadn't run off with another woman, but he'd actually been murdered. And in 6 months, she drank, she lost everything, and she finally died of starvation in Georgetown. So I can't end on one really negative story, so I have to tell you a little story that has nothing to do with 59'ers, but is sort of fun with my Lucky Hat Mine book. So I do a lot of research about the history of Colorado, and I try and incorporate those things. But I had a man one day walk up to me and he goes, "I've been to the Lucky Hat Mine." And I'm like, "Oh, really?" Because I sort of thought I made up that story. And he's like, "Oh, no, I've been to the Lucky Hat Mine. That's where a man threw his hat and it landed. And where it landed, he dug and he found his fortune." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's the story in my book." And so I always end these presentations by saying, my book is about a woman who answers a wife wanted ad in 1863, and she arrives in Idaho Springs to find the man she's supposed to marry dead. So if anybody ever hears that that's actually a true story, I would like to know. And with that, I want to thank you for listening to me. I definitely went faster than I intended to. My apology. Not having an audience and being able to time my presentation makes it a little difficult, but I am happy to open things up for questions. Brian, does anybody have any?
Sure, and thank you, Julie. And that's something we've discovered as well, is with these virtual presentations, they always seem to go faster than in-person presentations. So
it's very, very hard to do those because you can't really time it. You can't hear the laughter, see anybody faces. So, but hopefully people enjoyed it.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, a couple of questions here for you. You touched a little bit upon your book, The Lucky Hat Mine, and you also have your second novel, Denver City Justice. Could you tell us a little bit about the stories in these two books?
I would be happy to. So The Lucky Hat Mine is the story of a Southern belle who answers a wife wanted ad, and she travels to Idaho Springs in 1863 and arrives to find the man she's supposed to marry dead. So it's a cozy murder mystery. It can be listened to or heard or read by any age. And it's just the story of what it was like to live in Colorado at that time. I include a lot of the history of Idaho Springs. One of the things I really fell in love with is I found an oral history of the people who lived there. And so I ended up using them as characters and telling a lot of their stories in the book, because the Colorado history is my love. And the book was well received, and my publisher asked me to write a sequel. So Denver City Justice takes the main characters of the book and they moved to Denver 1864, where I incorporate a lot of the history of Denver into a cozy murder mystery. Once again, my main character has to solve a murder in order to save someone she loves. And she gets to experience like the Denver flood and several of the different histories there that I love. She meets Addie LaMont, so I thought that was sort of a fun thing. I had to have her meet my prostitute there. And so I incorporate those histories, and I'm excited to say that my publishers actually asked for a third one. So 1865 will be in South Park.
Oh, wonderful. We look forward to that. And of course, you had written your first nonfiction book on Elizabeth Byers, Denver pioneer. What book are you working on now, or what topics are you researching right now?
Well, I'm researching two. The third book in the series for The Lucky Hat, my publisher has asked for the manuscript to be done by February 1st, so I'm busy doing that. I'm really, really enjoying the history of South Park and some of the stories there, and so that's been a lot of fun. And then this presentation has sort of it keeps changing every year. Every time I give it, I add different things. And so I am actually working on a book of biographies that include a lot of the early pioneers who lived here in Colorado. And so hopefully that book will be something that a nonfiction publisher will be interested in, and I'll have fun going with that, because there's so many fascinating stories of so many of these women. I only included a couple of them.
And you had mentioned before too, normally when you do in-person presentation, you do them in more of a Chautauqua style, kind of dressed in the pioneer clothes and a lot more interactive. So hopefully we'll be able to see you in person sometime when it's allowed.
Boy, I hope so. As an attendee, I love coming to these presentations that are on Viber, and it means you can attend presentations all over the US. But as a presenter, it is very difficult to give a presentation when you see no one, when you're talking in a small room. And I'm like so used to hearing laughter. You know, I try and keep the presentations a little bit humorous, and it's really hard. So I hope next year there will be in-person presentations.
You bet. Well, you've done great, Julie. It's been a wonderful presentation. There are probably so many stories that have been lost to history because back then, so many of the everyday people, no social media, no voice to be recorded for history. But did you come across many instances of females who owned their own stakes and did their own mining and had any success with that?
So yes and no. Charlotte Card was definitely one of the women that I came across that seemed to do well as a miner. But you have to remember, at least for Anglo women, as soon as they entered into marriage, they lost most of the rights of their property, anything they had. So you have people like Augusta Tabor, who really did well in terms of business. She's the one that ran her husband's store. He might have been the postmaster, but she was the one that ran it. So these women did a lot that way, but they were very seldom recognized. What I found that's fascinating is like Amanche and then some of the southern Colorado Hispano women. These women were allowed to keep their property even after they married. And some of these women were the landowners. It's really interesting when you start looking into southern Colorado, when you look into the Hispano women, the Anglo men married these Hispano women because the land grants gave these women rights to land that they couldn't get a hold of. And so a lot of these women own the property, and yet their husbands, like Amanche's husband, were the ones that history pretty much recognizes.
Great. And being here in El Paso County, I'll put you on the spot. Of course, Cripple Creek and Victor. And I know your research goes before the big mining discoveries in those two mountain towns. But early on, or even past 1859 into the turn of the century, did you find any interesting women up in the mining area here in Teller County and El Paso County?
So I'll be honest, I have focused mostly on the 1860s. There's people who have settled there. I've actually read biographies about your sheriff, and there was like a woman that ran a boarding house, but I have not done a lot of history. I think that's an excellent thing for next time I come down to Pikes Peak. I will have a better answer, but no, I don't have any really good answers. I mean, there's fascinating women through history, but I've definitely focused on the earlier history that didn't include Cripple Creek or anything like that.
Sure. And it's especially good to see how you've discovered the stories of a lot of women, Amachi and Clara, who were minorities, African Americans, Native Americans, women who have had their own stories too and brought those to light. So many
right now I'm trying to get a biography together of a woman named Maria Belos, who settled in the San Luis Valley long before the Pikes Peak or bust gold rush. And what's fascinating is, you know, most of the people who settled, most of the Hispanos, they were illiterate. And so there's so little history. Doing the research in the traditional way that you do for an Anglo woman doesn't work because that history doesn't exist. And so a lot of it has got to be done by word of mouth. And it's the same thing if you try and do a Native American, trying to find that information and be accurate about it. A lot of it is just history that has been passed down word of mouth. So it's much more difficult to dig out the stories of these women, but we're trying.
Absolutely, and it's wonderful that you are, and good luck and continued success with that. If anyone has any last questions, please deposit them into the chat box. I'll remind of our attendees as well that this presentation is being recorded and will be available for watching on the Pikes Peak Library District's YouTube channel. We'll get that up there in a couple of days. And please check out Julie's books, The Lucky Hat Mine and Denver City Justice, and of course her biography of Elizabeth Byers, a Denver pioneer. And it looks like I will be in touch with our winner for your book. And so I'll send this person an email and get in touch with them for you, Julie. Thank you for doing that. And any last words for us this afternoon?
So I never really answered the question, who was the first woman? And that's because there really isn't an answer. You can look at the Anglo side and you can say, okay, maybe it was Katrina Murat. But then you look at the Hispano side and you have people like Teresa Sandoval, who arrived and lived in Fort Pueblo in 1841. So if anybody guessed Teresa Sandoval, that is the person, unless someone knows of someone earlier, that is the person I consider the first a non-native settler in Colorado, first woman, and she settled there in 1841.
In 1841. Excellent. Well, Julie, thank you for being with us this Wednesday afternoon. Thank you to all of our attendees for being with us as well. And we look forward to your books. They're available in bookstores, your favorite local bookstores, and of course, available through the Pikes Peak Library District. So please pick up a copy of her book and give it a read, packed with wonderful information about the history of Colorado. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I appreciate it, Brian.
You bet.